The first thing I noticed was the lavender perfume. Not the woman, not the suitcase by the stairs, not even the pair of high-heeled shoes sitting neatly beside my family photos like they belonged there. It was the perfume. Soft, powdery, floral, the kind of scent that lingers in a room after somebody has stopped trying to impress people and started getting comfortable instead. I stood in my own foyer at 6:13 in the morning with my overnight bag hanging from my shoulder and my mother's funeral dress still folded carefully in the trunk of my car. And for one strange second, I honestly wondered if I had walked into the wrong house. The grandfather clock near the dining room ticked steadily. Tick, tick, tick. I remember hearing birds outside the kitchen window, a lawn sprinkler running somewhere across the street, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning carrying on like my life hadn't just split clean down the middle. Then I heard laughter upstairs, a woman's laughter, low, sleepy, familiar with the walls. My hand tightened around the strap of my bag so hard my fingers cramped. "David?" I called. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. There was a pause upstairs, a muffled thud, whispering, then his footsteps. Fast, too fast. When my husband appeared at the top of the staircase, he looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost. For 32 years, I had known every version of David Parker's face. His tired face, his church face, his lying to the kids face, his worried about money face. But this one? This was panic. "Clara," he said too quickly, "you're home early." Not, "How was the drive?" Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "How's your mother?" Just, "You're home early." I don't know why that hurt more than the cheating itself. Maybe because my mother had been dead less than 48 hours. Maybe because I'd spent the last 6 months sleeping beside hospice machines while spoon feeding the woman who once braided my hair before school. Or maybe because when you've loved somebody for 32 years, you expect at least a moment of humanity before they betray you. I stared at him quietly. He was wearing the blue pajama pants I bought him last Christmas. There was lipstick near his collarbone. Not bright red lipstick either. Something worse. Something soft and domestic. Rose pink. The kind a woman wears when she plans on staying a while. Behind him I saw movement. Then she appeared. Barefoot. Wearing my robe. My robe. Cream-colored cotton with the tiny embroidered initials near the sleeve. C.P. Clara Parker. The woman couldn't have been older than 40. Pretty in that polished, expensive way. Smooth blonde hair. Fresh nails. Skin that looked cared for. She stopped when she saw me. For a moment, nobody spoke. And the strangest thing happened. Nobody looked ashamed. Uncomfortable, yes. Caught, certainly. But ashamed, no. David rubbed the back of his neck, the way he always did before difficult conversations. "Clara," he said carefully, "this isn't what it looks like." I almost laughed. Because what exactly did it look like? A strange woman in my robe standing outside my bedroom at sunrise, while my husband sweated through his apologies. It looked exactly like what it was, but I was too tired to scream, too hollow to cry. Grief does something peculiar to the body. It uses up all the emotions you thought you'd have saved for other disasters. My mother had died Saturday night at 11:42 p.m. holding my hand. I still had the hospital bracelet in my purse. And now here I was on Tuesday morning, staring at another kind of death entirely. The death of a marriage. The death of trust. The death of the home I thought I knew. "I came home because the funeral home called," I said calmly. "They needed me to sign additional paperwork." David blinked like he couldn't quite adjust to my tone. The woman shifted awkwardly beside him. "I'm sorry about your mother," she offered softly. I looked at her then, really looked, and somehow that made it worse, because she wasn't cruel looking. She wasn't glamorous or dramatic or cartoonishly evil. She looked normal, like the kind of woman who remembers birthdays and waters plants and asks waitresses how their day is going. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It rarely arrives wearing horns. Sometimes it arrives smiling politely in your bathrobe. "I think," I said carefully, "you should both get dressed." David opened his mouth immediately. "Clara, please." "No," I interrupted gently. "Not right now." That gentleness unsettled him more than anger would have. I could see it. He kept waiting for me to explode. But all I could think about was sleep. 6 months of caregiving had left me exhausted down to my bones. I had forgotten what uninterrupted rest even felt like. And suddenly I understood something with terrifying clarity. I did not have the energy to fight for a man who had already handed himself away. So instead, I walked past them. Past the staircase, past the smell of perfume, past the framed family photos lining the hallway. Our wedding picture still hung near the kitchen entrance. David had his arm around my waist and I was laughing at something the photographer said. "We look so young in that photo, so certain." I stopped in the kitchen and set my bag down slowly. The house looked different. Subtle changes. A vase of flowers I hadn't bought, a wine bottle chilling in the refrigerator, an unfamiliar handbag hanging over one of the dining chairs, evidence of another woman's comfort scattered quietly through the life I'd built. David followed me downstairs. I could hear her moving around upstairs after a few moments, drawers opening and closing carefully. Like she already knew where everything belonged. That thought nearly cracked something inside me. "How long?" I asked finally. David exhaled heavily. "Clara, how long?" His silence answered first, then, "About 8 months." 8 months. I actually nodded, because somehow hearing the number made all the little moments of the past year rearrange themselves into something ugly but understandable. The late meetings, the sudden gym membership, the new cologne, the emotional distance I blamed on my mother's illness. 8 months, which meant he had started sleeping with her while I was helping my mother through chemotherapy. I leaned against the kitchen counter because my knees suddenly felt unreliable. David stepped closer instinctively. "Funny how men still reach for you after they've shattered you." "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said quietly. And there it was. The sentence almost every betrayed woman hears eventually. As if infidelity were weather. As if another woman had simply fallen from the sky and landed accidentally in our bed. I stared at the man I'd spent most of my adult life loving. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "Do the children know?" His eyes shifted away. That was all the answer I needed. And somehow that hurt even more than the mistress upstairs. Because betrayal from a husband wounds the heart. But betrayal from your children? That reaches somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to heal. I looked toward the staircase slowly, then back at him. And for the first time in 32 years of marriage, I realized my husband had mistaken my kindness for weakness. What he didn't understand yet was that quiet women survive things loud women never have to imagine, and I was about to survive him. David stood in the kitchen like he expected me to collapse, or scream, or throw one of the ceramic plates I had spent 20 years collecting from antique shops and church sales. But grief had changed the texture of me. It had worn me down into something quieter, sharper. I pulled out a chair at the dining table and sat slowly, pressing both palms against the wood to steady myself. Outside, the sprinkler next door kept clicking rhythmically across somebody else's lawn. Normal life continuing. That felt offensive somehow. David remained standing. "I wanted to tell you," he said after a moment. I looked up at him. "No," I replied softly. "You wanted not to get caught." The truth landed between us heavily. He rubbed his jaw. That nervous habit again. Across the room, the coffee machine blinked 6:31 in green digital numbers. I realized suddenly that I hadn't eaten since the gas station outside Knoxville sometime around midnight. My body felt hollow and shaky. "I need coffee," I murmured more to myself than him. David moved automatically toward the cabinet where we kept the mugs, then stopped, because he didn't know where things were anymore. Not really. Not in the way I did. The woman upstairs probably knew better by now. That realization slid through me coldly, so I stood and reached for the cabinet myself. My favorite mug was missing. The blue ceramic one with the tiny painted daisies my daughter Emily had made during a pottery class years ago. I stared at the empty shelf space longer than necessary. Then I opened the dishwasher. There it was, lipstick stain on the rim, rose pink. I closed the dishwasher gently, very gently. People think betrayal happens in one dramatic moment, but it doesn't. It happens again and again in tiny discoveries. A toothbrush beside his, a perfume bottle near your sink, lipstick on your coffee cup, little funerals all day long. David watched me carefully while I poured coffee into the mug nearest to me. "You should sit down," he said quietly. I almost smiled at the absurdity. My husband had another woman upstairs in my bed, and he was still trying to manage me like a nervous patient. "I am sitting down," I replied. He exhaled heavily and pulled out the chair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I noticed his wedding ring was still on. That bothered me more than if he'd removed it, because it meant he had been living two lives at once without enough decency to choose between them. Finally, I asked, "Who is she?" He hesitated. "Her name is Vanessa." Vanessa. Of course it was something soft and polished like that. "Does Vanessa know your wife was changing adult diapers for her dying mother while you were sleeping with her?" "Clara, no. Answer me." His face tightened. "I told her things weren't good between us." I gave a tired little nod. There it was again. That convenient rewriting men do when they need to justify selfishness. 32 years reduced to things weren't good. As if marriage were measured only by happiness and not endurance. As if love didn't sometimes look like exhaustion and hospital waiting rooms and microwave dinners eaten at midnight. Upstairs, I heard footsteps again. Then silence. She was listening, probably deciding whether to leave through the back door or wait this out. I surprised myself by feeling almost sorry for her, because any woman willing to move into another woman's home before the marriage was even over clearly had very little sense of her own worth. "What did you tell the children?" I asked. David leaned back slowly. "They know we've been having problems." I stared at him. "Our son stopped calling me back 3 months ago." His eyes flickered. "Our daughter sounded uncomfortable every time I mentioned coming home." More silence. Then the truth arrived, quietly. They knew about her. David looked down at the table. That was confirmation enough. Something inside me shifted then. Not shattered, not exploded. Shifted. Like a heavy door quietly closing. Because a cheating husband is one grief. But realizing your children helped to protect the affair, that changes the entire landscape of a person's heart. I thought about every phone call I'd had from my mother's bedside, every rushed conversation, every dad's just stressed, every you should focus on grandma right now, all while another woman folded herself into my life back home. The humiliation of it burned slowly through me, not hot, cold, cold enough to think clearly, and clear thinking is dangerous, especially in women men believe they've defeated. David mistook my silence for surrender. I know this is awful timing, he said carefully. I actually laughed then. A small, exhausted sound. Awful timing? He swallowed hard. I didn't plan this. Did you plan for her to wear my robe? His face changed slightly. Embarrassment at last. Good. At least one person in this house still recognized shame. I told her not to come downstairs. The sheer stupidity of that sentence nearly amused me, as if modesty were the issue here. I took another sip of coffee and let the warmth settle into my chest. Then I asked the question I hadn't wanted answered. Are you in love with her? David looked toward the staircase instinctively before answering. Yes. That one hurt. Not because I doubted it, but because he said it with relief. Like finally speaking the truth after months of rehearsal. And maybe that was the cruelest part. While I was losing my mother inch by inch in a hospice room that smelled like antiseptic and stale pudding cups, my husband had been falling in love. I stared down into my coffee. When I finally spoke again, my voice sounded almost detached. How long has she been staying here? A few weeks. A few weeks. In my house. Sleeping in my bed while family photos still hung on the walls downstairs. And suddenly I understood something else too. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was replacement. They hadn't simply betrayed me. They had already started erasing me. That realization sharpened everything. I stood slowly from the table. David looked alarmed immediately. Where are you going? To shower. Clara, we should talk about this. I looked at him for a long moment. No, I said quietly. You should start thinking about what's going to happen next. His expression shifted then. Confusion. Because men like David assume calm women are passive women, he still thought he controlled the story. He had no idea I had spent the last 6 months learning how quickly life can strip everything away. Once you've watched someone you love die slowly, you stop being afraid of difficult decisions. I walked toward the staircase carefully. Halfway up, I saw her, Vanessa, standing near the bedroom doorway, now fully dressed in cream slacks and a pale sweater. Pretty, polished, nervous. She held herself like someone trying very hard to appear respectful in a situation that had already destroyed respect entirely. I'm really sorry, she said softly, and perhaps she meant it. But apologies offered from another woman's hallway carry very little weight. I studied her face, not with hatred. Oddly enough, that part hadn't arrived yet. Mostly I felt tired and observant, because there was something important I needed now. Information. Women survive betrayal by paying attention, and I intended to pay attention to everything. The guest bathroom has fresh towels, I told her calmly. Second door on the left. She blinked in surprise. David stared at me from downstairs, like he no longer recognized the woman he'd married. Truthfully, neither did I. I walked past Vanessa and entered my bedroom. Our bedroom. Their bedroom now too, apparently. The bed was unmade. One of my pillows lay on the floor, and on my nightstand sat a framed photograph of my mother holding Emily as a baby. Somehow that nearly undid me more than the affair itself, because my mother had died believing I still had a home to return to. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and stared at that photograph while the shower water started running somewhere down the hall. Then, for the very first time since walking through the front door, I cried, quietly, silently. The kind of crying that feels less like emotion and more like mourning, not just for my marriage, but for the woman I had been before this morning. I cried for exactly 7 minutes, not because the pain ended, but because years ago, when the children were small and life was loud and expensive and exhausting, I had taught myself how to stop crying before somebody needed dinner or laundry or a permission slip signed. Some habits stay in a woman long after the reasons for them disappear. By the time I stood from the bed, my breathing had steadied again. The house was quiet now, too quiet. I walked to the bathroom sink and splashed cold water against my face. My reflection looked older than it had a week ago. Grief had hollowed my cheeks slightly. There were faint purple shadows beneath my eyes from months of sleeping in hospital recliners. And beneath all that exhaustion sat something new, clarity. Not strength exactly. Strength sounds dramatic. This felt colder than that, more deliberate. I opened the medicine cabinet and noticed immediately that my lavender hand cream was gone. A ridiculous thing to notice during the collapse of a marriage. But betrayal lives in details. I stood there staring at the empty space on the shelf until I suddenly remembered something my mother once told me after my father's affair 38 years earlier. Women always know another woman has been in their space. Men think it's perfume and lipstick, but it's energy, it's displacement. At the time, I was too young to understand her. Now I understood perfectly. There was another woman's energy all over my life. I showered slowly. The water pressure had always been weak in that bathroom. David used to complain about it every winter. Funny the things the mind reaches for when it's trying not to drown. When I came downstairs 40 minutes later, Vanessa was gone. Only David remained, sitting at the kitchen table with both elbows resting on the wood and his phone untouched beside him. The moment he looked up at me, I realized something important. He expected forgiveness eventually, not immediately, not today, but someday. I could see it in his eyes. 32 years of marriage had convinced him that I would absorb this too somehow, that eventually we'd have difficult conversations, cry a little, disappoint the children, maybe separate quietly. He still believed he was dealing with the same woman who apologized to waiters when they brought her the wrong order. What he didn't understand yet was this. There are some betrayals that don't break women. They introduce them to themselves. "I made you toast," he said softly. I glanced toward the plate near the stove, burnt slightly around the edges. David had never learned patience in the kitchen. That almost made me smile. Almost. I called Emily. He continued carefully. "She's coming over." Of course she was. I nodded once and moved toward the refrigerator. The funeral home paperwork still waited in my purse. My mother's obituary needed approving by noon. There were flowers to arrange, church calls to return. And now, apparently, I also needed to survive the public dismantling of my family. The sheer exhaustion of it pressed against my ribs. "You should have told me before I came home," I said quietly, while pouring orange juice into a glass. David rubbed both hands over his face. "I was going to. When?" No answer. Because there never would have been a good time. Not during chemotherapy. Not during hospice. Not while I sat beside my mother's hospital bed holding a straw to her lips. Men like David wait for emotional weather to clear before confessing destruction they've already caused. But grief doesn't pause for convenience. Around 9:30, Emily arrived. I heard her car before I saw her, that familiar silver Honda pulling into the driveway too quickly. Then the front door opened. My daughter entered with her shoulders already tense, and that told me everything. Because children who discover shocking news don't usually walk into rooms prepared. Guilty people do. "Mom," she said immediately. Her voice sounded fragile, careful. I looked at her for a long moment. Emily was 30 years old now, but in stressful moments she still tucked her hair behind her ear, the same way she did as a little girl before piano recitals. "You knew," I said softly. Her eyes filled instantly. "Mom, you knew." David stood from the table immediately. "Clara, don't do this." I turned toward him slowly. "Don't do what? Acknowledge reality?" Emily started crying before either of us spoke again. And despite everything, despite the betrayal sitting heavily in my chest, some automatic maternal instinct still stirred painfully at the sound. That's the tragedy of motherhood. Love doesn't stop just because disappointment begins. "I didn't know what to say," Emily whispered. I stared at my daughter quietly. "When exactly were you planning to tell me another woman was living in my house?" She winced. The word house hit her harder than woman. Good. Because that was the true violation, wasn't it? Not just sex, replacement, erasure, family rearranging itself around my absence. Emily pulled out a chair slowly and sat down. Her makeup was smudged already beneath her eyes. "Dad said you were unhappy for years." I looked at David then, actually looked at him. 32 years together, and this man had apparently rewritten our marriage into a prison sentence while I was gone burying my mother. "Did I seem unhappy to you?" I asked her calmly. Emily cried harder. "Because children know? Deep down, they know. I had built birthday parties from grocery coupons, stayed awake through fevers, worked extra shifts during David's unemployment years, sat through every heartbreak and graduation and emergency room visit our family ever survived. Unhappy? No. Tired sometimes, lonely occasionally, but committed. There's a difference." "He said he fell in love," Emily whispered helplessly. I nodded slowly. "And what did you say?" Her silence answered loudly enough. Something inside me cooled further. Not hatred, something sadder than that. Disappointment settling permanently into bone. The front door opened again around 10:15. Our son Michael walked in carrying coffee cups from the cafe near his office. He stopped immediately when he saw me sitting there. And just like that, I knew. He knew too. Of course he did. Families rock quietly before they collapse publicly. "Mom?" he said cautiously. I looked at him. My son, the little boy who used to crawl into bed beside me during thunderstorms. The teenager who once cried when he left for college because he worried I would feel lonely without him. And now here he stood unable to meet my eyes because protecting his father's comfort had mattered more than protecting his mother's dignity. "How long?" I asked him. Michael swallowed hard. "A couple months." Emily started crying again beside him. David looked miserable now. Good. Let him finally sit inside the thing he'd created. Michael placed the coffee tray down awkwardly. "We didn't want to hurt you." I actually laughed then. A quiet, astonished sound. The kind people make when pain becomes almost surreal. "You let me bury my mother while strangers slept in my bed." Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. I came home from hospice every night exhausted and called my children for comfort. Michael looked sick now, as he should. And all that time, I continued softly, you already knew I didn't have a marriage anymore. Emily covered her face completely. David finally stepped forward. Enough. I turned toward him slowly. No, I said, not enough yet. Because something important was happening. For the first time, they were being forced to sit inside the reality they'd avoided. Affairs survive in secrecy, but truth sounds uglier once spoken aloud in daylight. I stood carefully from the table. My body still ached from the 14-hour drive home. I need to go to the funeral home. Emily immediately stood too. I'll come with you. I looked at her for a long moment, then shook my head gently. No, sweetheart. The word sweetheart nearly broke her. Good mothers know exactly how to wound without raising their voices. I picked up my purse and keys. As I walked toward the front door, Michael spoke quietly behind me. Mom, where are you going to stay? I paused, slowly turned back toward all three of them standing in my kitchen. My husband, my son, my daughter,